So thank you so much for that warm welcome. I'm looking forward to kind of spending the next hour with you all. I'd like to begin with a land and labor acknowledgement. And so I acknowledge the 22 Native nations that have inhabited central Arizona for centuries. Arizona State University's campuses are located in the Salt River Valley on ancestral territories of the Pima and Maricopa Indian communities, whose care and keeping of the land allows us to be here today. And I also acknowledge the labor of enslaved Africans and forced labors of people of Asian and Latine descent. We are indebted to their labor and their unwilling sacrifices that they've made across many generations. So to get started, I'd like to just take a moment to introduce myself and tell you all a little bit about me. I am a cisgendered woman. I'm Black and Latina. My dad is from Panama. I'm here in the United States in Arizona, and I'm married to a man who is from Nigeria and immigrated to the US and became a naturalized citizen. And we have two children who are 6 and 3, and that takes up a lot of my time. The pictures on the top right-hand corner is AEA last year with two of my students and my daughter. And then the picture right next to that is my son. That was actually at CREA, the Center for Cultural Responsive Evaluation and Assessment Conference. Anyone who knows me, my love language is memes and dressing alike. So like those are my two love languages. If I can get somebody to dress like me, and I actually, for those of you who will be at AA, I got everyone in my lab these like jackets and shirts, and we're all gonna be walking around wearing them because I'm super excited about that. So as Brad said, I've been kind of all over the place, but was fortunate enough to kind of make my way back home. Some of the things that I'm really excited about right now that I'm doing, in addition to being an associate professor at Arizona State University, is I'm currently on the board of directors for the American Evaluation Association. And I am a co-section editor, excuse me, for the Culture, Values, and Ethics section for AJE. Just a little bit about my research agenda, like why am I kind of qualified to talk about this and how is this related? I have three interconnecting strands for my research. The first is social justice oriented evaluation, and I look at issues related to power and culture and inclusion and culture responsiveness within evaluation. I've written a lot about, and I think a lot about teaching and mentoring and advising in evaluation, especially students from marginalized and underrepresented populations. And then I primarily work in science, technology, engineering, mathematics contexts because those are often funded and have lots of opportunities for evaluation, and because they're rife with inequities. And so they're a good place to kind of try out some of these ideas about what evaluation can and should be. So a couple of caveats, right, as we kind of think about cultural responsiveness and social justice in evaluation, right? The first is that, no one person can achieve cultural competence because culture is dynamic, it's ever changing, it's place bound, it's time bound, it's people and person bound. And so there's no way, it's more of a journey, right? And I love this picture. This is heading up to Sedona in Arizona. So there's no, no one can achieve competence, but it's something that we strive for. It's a bit of a journey. And as I've said, like cultures, norms, even equity they're dynamic. They shift with time and different contexts. In order to do this work well, you have to be open and vulnerable and self-aware. And, I've been asked by colleagues, like, would it be great if you could just make like a checklist, or if you could just like, yeah, check, I've done it. And I think there's no simple way to do it, especially because of the fact that the work that we do happens in dynamic contexts. And so just a couple of caveats there. And you all are here to see me, so I'm probably not going to spend a ton of time about the justification of why we do this work or why it's important. I'll say, we're in an interesting time in that after George Floyd's murder in 2020, there was an uptick in people who were kind of interested in issues of race and culture and diversity. And now, the pendulum is swinging back, especially for those of us who are here in the United States. I have clients who can't even use the word diversity or equity. And, they've had to change the language around the work that they're doing, and they've had to be more thoughtful, which has made me as an evaluator attempt to be really thoughtful about the work that we're doing, because, I don't do a ton of K-12 work. I work primarily in higher ed. But within higher ed, and especially within K-12, even here in Arizona, but especially in states like Florida and North Carolina and Texas, there are really strict rules about, what you can say. In Arizona, like critical race theory can't be taught in K-12. And so, I can't say like this is a critical approach or this is a social justice oriented approach. And, I've had interest holders tell me, well, this is a good report, but I think it's really useful, but I can't share it with any of my board or anything like that if you kind of have students or if you kind of alluded to the fact that you were attempting to be critical and attempting to really think well about issues of culture and diversity, which has been interesting. It's been an interesting time to as the pendulum kind of swings back. And so happy to talk about that a little bit more. There's all kinds of reasons and rationales for why we should think about culture and equity and diversity. And I think, just this idea that ultimately, and many have argued this, is that it's ultimately just good evaluation. And those who have been at the forefront of this work, who have spent their careers and their lives doing this work, like Geraldine Coffey and Stafford Hood and Rodney Hobson and many others who I've had the opportunity to be mentored by and well acquainted with, is that one of the reasons why they have coined these terms is that to kind of make it more present for us to be a bit more thoughtful and intentional in how we do this work. And for it's a value, it's an ethical imperative that we are really thoughtful about this, an attempt to kind of think about issues of challenging the status quo. And there's a difference of opinion, certainly, I think, within the social science inquiry field and evaluation specifically as well, about what exactly our role is, and happy to answer questions about that. But I just want to share this graphic from some work that I did with my colleagues. We actually did it, and I think it's important to note that we did a whole bunch of interviews with Black evaluators. I think there were maybe like 25 or 26 of them that we interviewed. They had many intersecting identities. Most of them were based in the US, different ages, right? People who were in their 70s, people who were in their 20s. And what we found was we were attempting to understand their identity and how it, in the intersection of their identity, what they believed their role was, and ultimately how that showed up in their evaluation practice. And ultimately, what this graphic is showing is that for Black evaluators, and then we did a follow-up with evaluators of color. And again, this is before kind of things got, everyone was kind of talking about cultural responsiveness and such, that their identity in terms of their racial and ethnic identity was really important to them in the work that they do, in their professional identity, in the professional and personal sense. And they saw themselves as advocates for social justice. And those two things showed up in what they believe that their role is as a professional evaluator, and it also showed up in their practice. And that's kind of what this intersecting diagram is showing. And so it's not a value that they have that they put on and take off. These are people who were doing evaluations in the 60s and the 70s. These are people who this work was really important to them. And it's not something that comes and goes or shifts with time when kind of it's a fad to talk about these issues, right? And so when we think about what's the imperative and what's the reasoning for this work, ultimately, there are some evaluators who kind of hold this to be a moral and ethical imperative. It's not simply a value. It's not a hat that they put on. It's not a glasses that they take on and take off. This is always who they are. This is part of their identity, and they see it as part of their role and practice. And so Kirkhart has talked a lot about the fact that, being thoughtful about this leads to higher validity, which she has talked about as multicultural validity. And I want to show two graphics because I don't want to spend a lot of time about the theory. I think one of the things when I've taught culture response evaluation and how I kind of want to spend my last 15 minutes of kind of structured time is more around kind of the practice and like, what does this look like? How do I do this? What are some considerations that I should have? That's kind of where I'm going. And I want to show these two graphics because the reality is that, the line from evaluation theory to practice is pretty convoluted, as we all know, right? It's not a straight line. There's lots of different things that go into and make up of what actually influences our practice, right? We have our own mental models. There's kind of evaluation theory. There's the context, which plays a huge role. There's kind of these overarching social science paradigms. And there's also kind of the programs theory, right? There's all of these different things that come to bear. And so my colleague Jill Srinath and I really thought about, okay, well, if you're going to do culture responsive work, and I know that Hood and Hobson and Kirkhart and Gordon have thought really well about like, what does this look like? But we took a step back and we thought about, okay, there's really these two components to doing kind of social justice, culture responsive work. On the right-hand side, there's a conceptual side, right? Even before you can get down to actually doing culture responsive work, there's other work that should be done in the background, right? The first is really understanding that everything that happens, all of the products of evaluation, and Hazel Simonet has talked a lot about this idea that any social science inquiry, the results of that are culturally steeped. They're cultural products, right? And so if you're going to be consuming something, we have to be thoughtful about the role that community-centric bias, which is a tendency to make all kind of value judgments based on like our own ideas, our own experiences, right? And there's all different types of racism and lots of other isms that play a role, and whether it's kind of at the societal level or the individual level, and these come to bear. And so just really being thoughtful about that may not always show up in your evaluation reports, but like having a bit of a worldview that understands that. Also locating ourselves, developing our own mental models, understanding, our own personal background and our own biases and how those kind of come to bear in the work that we do. And I think really those two things are precursors to actually doing the work. And then on the left-hand side, we have these like a methodological aspects, right? Which has been talked about a bit, but not a ton of research done on this. And my dissertation, one of the things I found was that if you're attempting to do culture responsive work and you're attempting to be thinking about issues of justice and culture and diversity and inclusion, ultimately, yes, it definitely shows up formally, right? In your evaluation questions and your instrument develop and your analysis. I'm about to talk about that in a second. But also, it really shows up informally, right? And one of the things I want you to think about is if you're uncomfortable talking about issues of race or culture or religion or any of these sorts of things, if you're uncomfortable having informal conversations about them in professional settings, then it's going to be really hard to do it formally. It's going to be really hard to ask formal questions and collect formal data around these topics. And I found that when you're attempting to be thoughtful about this, ultimately, it shows up in meetings, it shows up in emails, and we have to be prepared to kind of confront these issues and have these difficult conversations head on. And so I just want to make a note about that. I want to get to a couple of the key tenets of culture responsiveness and what this looks like in practice. And then I want to give you a couple of examples of what this looks like in terms of some of the work that I've done. So, equity focused, and I, there's like a gazillion there's not a gazillion, there's actually 101, right? Michael Quinn-Patton has found this. There's 101 evaluation approaches or theories, right, that have been out here. And so, when I'm talking about culture responsiveness, and honestly, when Stafford Hood coined the term or developed the term culture responsive evaluation, he meant social justice oriented and equity focused, right? Like, when I see CREE, like CREE, it's almost like, you're just saying it twice because this is what the focus was, but sometimes we use different language, different words for what is going to be accepted. But that's another conversation. Anyway, so I use kind of the terms. I recognize that equity means something different than diversity, it means something different than inclusion. But to me, it all ultimately is about social justice. And so I kind of use all these terms, not interchangeably, but I'm talking about kind of similar things. And so ultimately, culture responsive work really attempts to engage with and attend to culture. And I have the great honor, not pleasure, but the great honor of leading a new directions for evaluation, and over half of those are open access. So I would encourage you all to go take a look at that, where one of them, we did an oral history of culture responsive evaluation, kind of how it came to be within the field. That's an open access. So you can literally just type in my name and type in new directions and that will pop up. Also in the introduction, we kind of lay the groundwork and the framework for what culture responsive evaluation is. So there's lots of kind of empirical and kind of reflective things out there, especially in that new directions from, it was let's see, winter 2023. And so anyways, ultimately these frameworks, what you're attempting to do is you're attempting to be thoughtful about the program's culture and socio-political context. You're attempting to kind of develop questions while including multiple interest holders. And I'm actually intentionally using the word interest holders and not stakeholders. This is an old slide, so I haven't changed that over. But all culturally responsive work is collaborative in nature. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's participatory, but it is collaborative in nature. And ultimately, you're attempting to get use data collection methods that are commensurate with the population, and then sharing findings with a variety of audiences in ways that can be understood and picked up. And I'm going to give some examples of that. And this is a nice depiction of the wheel of Frierson et al., and as well as Hood et al., 2015, and Frierson et al., 2002. And what basically this wheel is saying is if you're going to attempt to be culture responsive, you have to do it at every single phase of evaluation. I sometimes will have people come to me and say, oh, we're working with the Latine population, like, let's translate this survey into Spanish. And I'm like, that's a great idea, comma, and we should have been doing like 5 other things before we got to the point where it's time to select and adapt the instrumentation. And so that's just what this is showing here, is that we should be thoughtful about this all throughout. And so what I've done here is I pulled some slides from when I've taught about culture responsive and like looking at the different components of an evaluation and tried to give examples. But what I'm going to do for the last little bit of time that we have here is I'm going to talk about some examples from practice that are specifically around kind of evaluation design and instrumentation. So when you're attempting to be culture responsive or think about issues of equity, and you get to the point where you're thinking about instrumentation, you need to consider the participants. You need to consider your audience. And I have a lot of clients, especially because I work in STEM, where they want me to go find like a validated instrument. And I'm like, yes, validated instruments are important. They're really useful. But, if they've been validated with a certain population and you're working with a completely different population, one, we're going to change the instrument. We're just going to do it. And then that instrument is no longer valid. And 2, even if you wanted me to keep the instrument exactly the same, just because it's been validated with one population and normed with one population, it's no longer normed when we work with a different population. And this is something that I have to spend a lot of time in explaining kind of the psychometrics of how things work to my clients, but it's something that's worth doing, right? I also want to note that translation is the beginning, but not the end. It's important that we have instruments that are in the native language of our participants, but simply translating something is not enough, right? We have to make sure that it fits the context in which they're working and in which they're kind of receiving or participating in a program. And I'm going to give an example of what that looks like in just a second. And it's really useful to kind of pilot test any of your instruments, whether it's an interview instrument or whether it's even a survey instrument. And so I have a project with the University of Puerto Rico, Humacao, and it's a Howard Hughes Medical Institute grant. And one of the things that they wanted us to do was they really wanted us to understand, like, what's the climate of the faculty and students who are within all of their kind of STEM departments. And their campus, they're part of the University of Puerto Rico system. Their campus is kind of known for having be more STEM focused. And so, they asked us to do this climate investigation. And so we began with a survey. And what we did was, first, we translate the survey to Spanish. But for anyone who understands anything about linguistics or anything like that, the reality is translating something into a language, Spanish in Mexico is different than Spanish in the US, is different than Spanish in Puerto Rico. And so even the way that we talk about race is completely different in the US than how they talk about it, and ethnicity is different in the US than how they talk about it in Puerto Rico. And so what we did was we translated the survey, this long survey, and we began with the validated instrument, but then we did a whole bunch of cognitive interviews. So we let people go through and take the survey, and then they spoke to us out loud about like what was going through their mind as they were taking the survey. And then we also did like some focus groups, and we had a lot of input from the administrators who were part of the grant. And we ultimately ended up with a completely different survey than the one that we started with. Not only was it translated into Spanish, but it just was different because it just made sense to ask slightly different questions. And the language didn't, translate a one-to-one. The person who translated it was Mexican and Guatemalan. And we realized, and I speak Spanish pretty well, but I'm not completely fluent. And so we wanted to make sure that it just made sense for the participants. And then after we did all that, then we went back and we validated the instrument, right? So then we ran all the psychometrics, and this took a ton of time. It ate up a little bit more of the budget than we had originally anticipated, but then we ended up with this instrument that was perfect for this population. And that was, I think, one example of us trying to be really thoughtful. So also I want to just mention this idea that when you're collecting data and you're attempting to be culture responsive, part of what's really important is that participants are able to kind of voice their own reality, and that you have to kind of like get at and understand like nonverbal behaviors and understand the nuances of different populations and different cultures. And that's why one of the things that culture responsive evaluation really recommends is having, an evaluation team that has a variety of lived experiences and a variety of backgrounds, especially in some of those that are shared with the participants. I'll give a quick example. I did an evaluation for the Illinois P20 Council. And one of the things that we really wanted to do was when people think of Illinois, they think of Chicago. But I mean, Chicago is in Illinois and a huge populace, but like everywhere else in Illinois is nothing like Chicago. Illinois is very rural. There's a lot of farming communities. And what we wanted to do was when we were asking parents to weigh in on a new policy that they were putting into place about the core competencies for children in K-12. And we really wanted to make sure that we heard from people not just in Chicago, is where I'm going with this. And so we did all these focus groups. We traveled all across the state. We offered the focus group in multiple languages. We even offered childcare, right? Because it seems silly to ask people to come and then say, well, you can't bring your children, even though this is about your children. And we offered it, and this is before like the age of Zoom. So it was like a big deal to like offer things in Skype and everything like that. And so we did just like a ton of focus groups, and it took a ton of time, and it was a ton of really to get at everything and to analyze the data. But ultimately we felt we were really happy with the products that we had because we took this additional time. I'm going to give one final example, and it's about data analysis. And so, it's one thing to gather the data in a culture responsive way. It's one thing to kind of develop the instruments in a culture responsive way, but you have to continue, you have to keep this going, right? Even when you're analyzing the data. And so the first thing everyone should be doing is you should be disaggregating any quantitative you have, even if it's, I do a lot of climate surveys, and sometimes there's only like, 3 people in a cell or 3 people of a certain population. And yes, 100%. I'm not like running statistical analyses with cell size of like 100 people in one category and 3 people in another category, but I am looking for trends, right? And sometimes those 3 people, their voice and their experience is important. And I have found that sometimes once you break out the data like this, I have found differences. And then what do you do with that? Well, then you go and you do follow-up interviews, follow-up conversations to kind of unearth what exactly is happening. And so I just want to give one final example before we kind of transition to our conversation, is that I had a project where it's called the Education Justice Project, and it was for men who were incarcerated at the Danville Correctional Center in Illinois. And so it was a higher education program within prison. And one of the things that we realized early on was that, while we did have a diverse evaluation team, I've never been incarcerated. No one in my immediate family has been incarcerated. The same was true of others. And so we really sought to have the students, the men who were incarcerated, be part of the evaluation team in a way that was incredibly collaborative. And I wouldn't quite say that it was participatory because there was a lot of rules around like them collecting data and them having access to computers and stuff like that. And so, but every time we develop an instrument, we went and we talked to them about it. Even when we like analyzed data, we went back to them, and they actually were able to like help us understand nuances and understandings of even their interactions with the correctional officers there. We had like completely misinterpreted some of those interactions, and that was really useful. And then, with respect to the findings, not only did we go to the correctional facility and present our findings, there was a group for their family members, like support system for their family members. And this was located in Chicago. We went up to Chicago and presented the findings of the report to their family members as well, which was, I think, just so impactful to like for their family members to learn the ways in which they were, being challenged and changed by their experience in this program. And so, ultimately, when you think about the wheel of evaluation and what it means to think about these issues, if you take away nothing from, this rapid fire, is that it's not 2 things. One, it's not something that a lot of people, especially people who come from minoritized groups, doing culture responsive evaluation is not like, oh, well, today I'm going to do utilization focus. Today I'm going to do culture responsive. It's like, this is what I do. This is who I am. And I may take other pieces from these other approaches, but this is kind of my home base. And then also it happens it kind of takes a lot of self-reflective work before you even get into the evaluation. And then when you actually get to the formal methods, it's not just at the data collection. It's not just at developing instrumentation. It's something that you should be thoughtful about, throughout.